Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other girls in her small Texas town of Millbrook. While her classmates spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, Sarah could be found in the local library, reading everything she could get her hands on about military history, particularly stories about fallen soldiers and their families. Her fascination wasn't born from a casual interest in war stories, but from something much deeper and more personal. The morning of her 18th birthday, Sarah walked into Ink and Honor, the only tattoo parlor in town, with a folded piece of paper clutched tightly in her trembling hand. The design she carried had been sketched and resketched dozens of times over the past year, each line representing something sacred to her. The tattoo artist, a burly man named Marcus with arms covered in military insignia, looked at the young woman with curiosity as she unfolded the paper on his counter. What Sarah showed him wasn't the typical butterfly, flower, or inspirational quote that most 18-year-olds requested for their first tattoo. Instead, it was an intricate design featuring a military helmet sitting atop a rifle, with dog tags hanging from the barrel, and a pair of combat boots positioned at the base. Surrounding this central image were the names of 23 soldiers, each written in elegant script, forming a circle around the memorial design. Marcus studied the drawing carefully, his weathered face growing serious as he read through the names. These weren't random names pulled from a war memorial or a history book. Each name had been carefully researched, each soldier's story painstakingly learned and memorized by the young woman standing before him. These were real men who had given their lives in service to their country, and Sarah wanted to honor them in the most permanent way she knew how. The story behind Sarah's unusual tattoo began 3 years earlier when she was just 15 years old. Her English teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had assigned a project about local heroes, expecting students to write about firefighters, police officers, or community volunteers. While her classmates chose the obvious subjects, Sarah decided to research soldiers from their county who had died in recent conflicts. What started as a simple school assignment became an obsession that would change the trajectory of her entire life. Sarah's research led her to the Millbrook Public Library's archives, where she spent countless hours poring over newspaper clippings, obituaries, and military records. She discovered that 23 young men from their small county had been killed in action in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade. Most of them had been barely older than Sarah herself when they died, their lives cut short while serving their country thousands of miles from home. As Sarah delved deeper into each soldier's story, she began to feel a profound connection to these young men she had never met. She learned about Private First Class Michael Rodriguez, who had been killed by an improvised explosive device just 2 weeks before his 19th birthday. He had planned to use his military benefits to attend college and become a teacher, just like his mother. There was Sergeant David Thompson, a father of 2 young children, who had been killed while trying to evacuate wounded civilians from a bombed marketplace in Baghdad. Each story broke Sarah's heart a little more, but also strengthened her resolve to ensure these heroes were never forgotten. She visited their graves in the county cemetery, leaving flowers and small American flags. She reached out to their families, some of whom were touched by the young girls' genuine interest in preserving their loved ones' memories. Others were too consumed by grief to engage, but Sarah understood and respected their pain. The project that was supposed to take a few weeks stretched into months, then years. Sarah became the unofficial keeper of these soldiers' stories, memorizing details about their lives, their dreams, their families, and their sacrifices. She attended memorial services, helped organize fundraisers for military families, and even started a small scholarship fund in honor of the fallen soldiers. When Sarah finally turned 18, she knew exactly how she wanted to honor these heroes permanently. The tattoo would be her way of carrying their memories with her always, ensuring that wherever she went, their stories would go too. She had saved every penny from her part-time job at the local grocery store to pay for the tattoo, despite knowing that her decision would likely shock and dismay many people in her conservative community. Marcus, the tattoo artist, was initially hesitant to create such an elaborate and meaningful piece for someone so young. He had seen too many teenagers make impulsive decisions about permanent body art, only to regret them later. But, as Sarah explained the significance of each name and shared the stories she had learned, Marcus realized this wasn't a typical teenage impulse. This young woman had thought carefully about her decision and understood the weight of what she was asking for. The tattooing process took nearly 8 hours, spread across 2 sessions. Sarah endured the pain without complaint, focusing on the faces and stories of the soldiers whose names were being permanently etched into her skin. With each name that was completed, she silently said a prayer of remembrance, thanking each fallen hero for his service and sacrifice. When the tattoo was finally finished, Sarah looked at it in the mirror and felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before. The artwork was beautiful, but more importantly, it was meaningful. She was now permanently connected to these 23 heroes, carrying their memory wherever life might take her. However, Sarah had underestimated how her community would react to her decision. Word spread quickly through Millbrook about the young woman with the military memorial tattoo. While some people, particularly veterans and military families, understood and appreciated the sentiment behind her choice, many others were less accepting. At her high school graduation just a few weeks later, Sarah wore a conservative dress that covered most of the tattoo, but part of it was still visible on her upper arm. She could hear the whispers and see the disapproving looks from other parents and community members. Some called it inappropriate for a young woman to have such a large, visible tattoo. Others questioned her motives, suggesting she was seeking attention or trying to make some kind of political statement. The criticism stung, but Sarah remained steadfast in her conviction that she had made the right choice. She had not gotten the tattoo for attention or to make a statement about war or politics. She had done it out of genuine love and respect for soldiers who had given their lives in service to others. If people couldn't understand that, Sarah decided, that was their problem, not hers. As summer progressed, the negative reactions to Sarah's tattoo seemed to intensify rather than diminish. At her job at the grocery store, customers would sometimes stare openly at her arm or make snide comments about kids today and their poor choices. Her manager, Mr. Johnson, who was generally supportive, suggested she might want to wear long sleeves to avoid making customers uncomfortable. Even some of Sarah's friends began to distance themselves from her, not because they disagreed with her choice, but because they were tired of the drama and attention that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Sarah found herself increasingly isolated, spending more time alone with her books and her memories of the fallen soldiers whose names she now carried. The breaking point came in late July when Sarah attended the annual Millbrook Summer Festival. She had worn a sleeveless blouse, not thinking much about covering her tattoo since she would be mostly among people she had known all her life. As she walked through the festival grounds, enjoying the carnival rides and local food vendors, she noticed a group of women from her church whispering and pointing in her direction. Mrs. Davidson, the church treasurer and one of the most prominent gossips in town, approached Sarah with a look of barely concealed disgust on her face. Without any preamble, she loudly announced that Sarah's tattoo was disgraceful and disrespectful to the memory of real soldiers. She suggested that Sarah didn't understand what true sacrifice meant and that her tattoo was nothing more than a vulgar display that cheapened the memory of the heroes she claimed to honor. The confrontation drew a crowd of onlookers, and Sarah found herself at the center of a heated public debate about the appropriateness of her tattoo. Several people voiced their agreement with Mrs. Davidson, while others tried to defend Sarah's right to express herself as she chose. The young woman stood in the middle of it all, feeling humiliated and alone, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. That night, Sarah went home and cried harder than she had since beginning her research on the fallen soldiers 3 years earlier. She questioned everything about her decision, wondering if the critics were right, and she had somehow dishonored the very people she had tried to memorialize. The weight of the community's disapproval was crushing, and for the first time since getting the tattoo, Sarah seriously considered having it removed. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling and fighting back tears, Sarah made a decision that would prove to be pivotal in her life. Instead of hiding from the criticism or giving in to the pressure to remove her tattoo, she would find a way to prove that her intentions had been pure and her tribute was appropriate. She didn't know how yet, but she was determined to show everyone that she truly understood and honored the sacrifice represented by each name on her arm. The next morning, Sarah began researching military protocols and traditions, looking for ways to properly honor fallen soldiers. She reached out to veterans organizations, military historians, and Gold Star families, seeking guidance and support. What she discovered would not only validate her choice, but would eventually lead to one of the most powerful moments of recognition she could never have imagined. Little did Sarah know that her journey was just beginning, and that the tattoo that had brought her so much pain and criticism would soon become the catalyst for an encounter that would change her life forever and proved to her entire community that true honor comes in many forms. The weeks following the summer festival incident marked a turning point in Sarah's life. Instead of retreating into herself or giving up on her mission to honor the fallen soldiers, she channeled her pain and frustration into action. Every morning, she would wake up early and spend hours researching military traditions, veteran support organizations, and ways to properly commemorate those who had given their lives in service to their country. Sarah's first breakthrough came when she discovered the Gold Star Families organization online. Gold Star families are those who have lost a service member during military service, and their mission to preserve the memory of fallen heroes resonated deeply with Sarah's own goals. She spent several evenings crafting a carefully worded email to the organization's local chapter, explaining her story, her tattoo, and her desire to honor the 23 soldiers whose names she carried. To her surprise and relief, the response came within just 2 days. Janet Morrison, the local Gold Star Families coordinator and mother of Marine Lance Corporal Timothy Morrison, who had been killed in Afghanistan in 2011, wrote back with warmth and understanding. Not only did Janet approve of Sarah's tribute, but she invited the young woman to attend their next monthly meeting to share her story with other military families. The meeting was held in a small conference room at the local VFW hall, and Sarah arrived 30 minutes early, her stomach churning with nervousness. She had printed out copies of her research on each of the 23 soldiers, complete with their photos, service records, and the circumstances of their deaths. As the families began to arrive, Sarah was struck by the mixture of pride and pain that seemed to emanate from each person in the room. When Janet introduced Sarah to the group, there was an initial moment of surprise as the gathered families took in the sight of the young woman with the elaborate military memorial tattoo. But as Sarah began to share her story, explaining how her high school project had evolved into a personal mission to preserve the memory of local fallen heroes, the atmosphere in the room shifted from curiosity to deep appreciation. Sarah opened her folder and began reading the name and story of each soldier represented on her tattoo. For Army Specialist Jennifer Walsh, who had been killed by a roadside bomb while delivering medical supplies to a remote outpost, Sarah had learned that Jennifer had wanted to become a nurse and had joined the military to pay for her education. She had been engaged to her high school sweetheart and had planned a small wedding for when she returned home. As Sarah continued through the list, she noticed that several people in the room were crying. When she read about Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, who had thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad members and had been posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, an older African-American woman in the back row stood up and identified herself as Marcus's aunt. She had never heard anyone outside of their family speak about Marcus with such knowledge and reverence. By the time Sarah finished reading all 23 names and sharing what she had learned about each soldier's life and sacrifice, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The families surrounded her with hugs and words of gratitude, telling her that she had given them a precious gift by keeping their loved ones' memories alive in such a meaningful way. Janet Morrison pulled Sarah aside after the meeting and made a suggestion that would prove to be life-changing. She told Sarah about the annual Veterans Day ceremony that took place at the county courthouse, where hundreds of people gathered to honor local veterans and fallen heroes. Janet suggested that Sarah should speak at this year's ceremony, sharing her story and reading the names of the soldiers whose memory she carried. The idea terrified Sarah, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She had spent 3 years learning these stories in private, sharing them only with family members and a few close friends. Speaking publicly about her research and her tattoo would put her in a vulnerable position, especially given the negative reactions she had already experienced in her community. But the encouragement of the Gold Star families gave her the courage she needed to say yes. Sarah spent the next 2 months preparing for her Veterans Day speech. She wrote and rewrote her remarks dozens of times, working to strike the right balance between honoring the fallen soldiers and explaining her personal journey. She practiced in front of her bedroom mirror, in her car, and even in the empty grocery store where she worked after closing time. As Veterans Day approached, word began to spread through Millbrook about Sarah's planned speech. The local newspaper ran a small article about the upcoming ceremony, mentioning that a local young woman would be sharing stories of fallen heroes. Some people in the community were supportive, while others remained skeptical about Sarah's motives and the appropriateness of her tattoo. The morning of Veterans Day dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn weather that made everything feel possible. Sarah arrived at the courthouse square an hour before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, wearing a conservative navy blue dress that she had borrowed from her mother. The tattoo on her arm was clearly visible, and Sarah had decided not to try to hide it. If she was going to speak about honoring these soldiers, she wanted people to see the tribute she had made to them. As the crowd began to gather, Sarah recognized many faces from her community. There were veterans from multiple conflicts, active duty service members home on leave, and families of both living and fallen soldiers. She also noticed several of the people who had criticized her tattoo in the past, including Mrs. Davidson from the summer festival incident. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by the local high school JROTC unit, followed by the national anthem and the Pledge of Allegiance. Local dignitaries gave brief remarks about the importance of honoring those who had served, and several veterans shared personal stories about their time in the military. When Janet Morrison stepped up to the microphone to introduce Sarah, the young woman felt her heart begin to race. This was her moment to prove that her tribute was genuine and appropriate, or to face even more criticism and rejection from her community. As she walked to the podium, Sarah caught sight of her parents in the crowd, their faces filled with pride and support despite their initial concerns about her tattoo. Sarah began her speech by explaining how her high school project had led her to discover the stories of 23 local heroes who had given their lives in service to their country. She spoke about the hours she had spent researching each soldier's life, visiting their graves, and connecting with their families. Her voice grew stronger as she explained her decision to get the tattoo, describing it not as a fashion statement or an act of rebellion, but as a permanent commitment to carry these heroes' memories wherever life might take her. As Sarah began to read the names and stories of the fallen soldiers, something remarkable happened. The crowd, which had been politely attentive at the beginning of her speech, became completely silent and focused. People who had been checking their phones or whispering to neighbors stopped what they were doing and listened intently to every word Sarah spoke. She told the story of Private First Class Antonio Valdez, who had been killed while providing covering fire for evacuating civilians. Antonio had been an artist before joining the army, and his squad members said he used to draw portraits of local children in Iraq to help them smile despite the war happening around them. Sarah had tracked down some of Antonio's artwork and had included small reproductions of his drawings in her research folder. When Sarah shared the story of Navy Corpsman Michael Chan, who had been killed while treating wounded Marines under enemy fire, she explained how Michael's parents had told her that their son had always wanted to be a doctor and had planned to use his military training to work in emergency medicine when he came home. The Chin family had been so moved by Sarah's interest in their son's story that they had invited her to their home for dinner and shared photo albums spanning Michael's entire life. As Sarah continued through her list, she began to notice that people in the crowd were not just listening politely, but were genuinely moved by the stories she was telling. Several veterans were saluting as she read each name, and she could see tears in the eyes of many audience members. Even Mrs. Davidson, who had been so critical of Sarah's tattoo, was wiping her eyes and nodding along as Sarah spoke. The most powerful moment of Sarah's speech came when she read the name of Staff Sergeant David Riley, who had been killed while defusing an improvised explosive device that threatened a school full of children. Sarah explained how David's mother had told her that her son had always loved children and had coached Little League Baseball before deploying to Afghanistan. David had written letters to the children on his team while overseas, encouraging them to work hard in school and follow their dreams. As Sarah concluded her speech by thanking the community for allowing her to share these stories and asking everyone to remember that freedom isn't free, the crowd erupted in sustained applause. People were standing and clapping, and several veterans were saluting both Sarah and the memory of the fallen soldiers she had honored. After the ceremony, Sarah was overwhelmed by the positive response from the community. People who had never spoken to her before approached to thank her for her tribute and to tell her how moved they had been by her speech. Several veterans told her that she had done something important by preserving these stories and sharing them with people who might not otherwise have known about these heroes. Mrs. Davidson, the woman who had confronted Sarah so harshly at the summer festival, approached her with tears in her eyes and an expression of genuine remorse. She apologized for her earlier comments, explaining that she hadn't understood the depth of Sarah's research or the sincerity of her intentions. She told Sarah that her speech had taught her something important about not judging others before understanding their motivations. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Sarah's Veterans Day speech, complete with photos of her speaking at the podium and quotes from community members who had been moved by her presentation. The article described her tattoo not as a controversial statement, but as a meaningful tribute to fallen heroes. Several other newspapers in surrounding counties picked up the story, and Sarah began receiving emails and letters from people across the state who had been touched by her dedication to honoring military sacrifice. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the families of the soldiers Sarah had honored. In the days following the ceremony, she received calls and letters from relatives of several of the fallen heroes, thanking her for keeping their loved ones' memories alive and for sharing their stories with such respect and reverence. The success of Sarah's Veterans Day speech marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She was invited to speak at other military events and ceremonies throughout the region, and she began working with local veterans organizations to create a more permanent memorial to fallen heroes from their county. What had started as a high school project and evolved into a personal mission was becoming something much larger and more impactful than Sarah had ever imagined. However, the most life-changing moment was still to come. Sarah's story and her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers would soon catch the attention of someone whose recognition would validate her tribute in a way that would shock even her strongest supporters and silence her remaining critics forever. 3 weeks after Sarah's Veterans Day speech, she was stocking shelves at the grocery store where she worked when her manager, Mr. Johnson, approached her with an unusual expression on his face. He told her there was a phone call for her in the office, and when Sarah asked who it was, Mr. Johnson just shook his head and said she needed to take it immediately. Sarah made her way to the small office behind the customer service counter, wondering who could possibly be calling her at work. As she picked up the phone, she heard a crisp, authoritative voice on the other end that immediately commanded her attention. The caller introduced himself as Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Harrison from Naval Special Warfare Command, and he explained that he had read about Sarah's Veterans Day speech in a military publication that had picked up the story. Sarah's heart began to race as Master Chief Harrison explained that her story had been circulating among military personnel and had eventually made its way to some very high-ranking officers. He told her that there was someone who wanted to meet her, someone whose name Sarah immediately recognized when he mentioned it: Commander James Mitchell, one of the most decorated Navy SEAL officers in recent history. Commander Mitchell had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, had been involved in several high-profile missions that had saved countless lives, and was known throughout the military community for his dedication to honoring fallen comrades. Master Chief Harrison explained that Commander Mitchell was currently stationed at a nearby naval base and had specifically requested to meet with Sarah after learning about her tattoo and her commitment to preserving the memory of fallen soldiers. The phone call lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like a lifetime to Sarah. Master Chief Harrison arranged for Sarah to visit the naval base the following Saturday, explaining that Commander Mitchell wanted to personally thank her for her tribute and to discuss her ongoing work with military families. As Sarah hung up the phone, she could hardly believe what had just happened. One of the most respected officers in the Navy wanted to meet with her personally. The days leading up to the meeting passed in a blur of nervous excitement. Sarah researched everything she could find about Commander Mitchell, learning about his distinguished service record and his reputation for taking care of his men and honoring those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. She also spent hours preparing her research materials, organizing the folders containing information about each of the 23 soldiers whose names were tattooed on her arm. On Saturday morning, Sarah dressed in her most conservative outfit and drove the 2 hours to the naval base, accompanied by her parents who were both proud and nervous about their daughter's upcoming meeting. The base was impressive and intimidating, with its high security fences and serious-looking personnel checking identification at every checkpoint. After passing through several security screenings, Sarah and her parents were escorted to a conference room in the base's administrative building. The room was decorated with military memorabilia and portraits of distinguished naval officers, and Sarah felt a sense of reverence as she waited for Commander Mitchell to arrive. When the door opened and Commander Mitchell walked in, Sarah was immediately struck by his presence. He was tall and fit, with graying hair and intense blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite his intimidating reputation, his demeanor was warm and approachable as he introduced himself to Sarah and her parents. Commander Mitchell began the meeting by thanking Sarah for her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. He explained that in his years of military service, he had encountered many people who paid lip service to supporting the troops, but few who had made the kind of personal commitment that that Sarah had made. He was particularly impressed by the depth of her research and the respectful way she had approached the families of the fallen soldiers. As their conversation continued, Sarah shared her folders of research with Commander Mitchell, explaining how she had learned about each soldier's life, service, and sacrifice. The commander listened intently as Sarah recounted the stories of Private Rodriguez, Sergeant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Johnson, and all the others whose names were permanently etched into her skin. Commander Mitchell was particularly moved by Sarah's story about Navy Corpsman Michael Chun, whose parents Sarah had befriended after learning about their son's heroic actions in Afghanistan. The commander explained that he had actually served alongside Corpsman Chun during one of his deployments and could personally vouch for the young man's courage and dedication to saving lives under fire. After reviewing all of Sarah's research materials, Commander Mitchell made a statement that would stay with Sarah for the rest of her life. He told her that in all his years of military service, he had never encountered a civilian who had shown such genuine understanding of what military sacrifice truly meant. He said that her tattoo was not just appropriate, but was one of the most meaningful tributes to fallen soldiers he had ever seen. The conversation then took an unexpected turn when Commander Mitchell asked Sarah about her future plans. She explained that she was planning to attend college in the fall to study history, with the hope of eventually working in military archives or with veterans organizations. She wanted to continue her work honoring fallen soldiers and helping preserve their stories for future generations. Commander Mitchell nodded approvingly and then made a suggestion that took Sarah completely by surprise. He told her about a special ceremony that was being planned for the following month at the Pentagon, where several fallen soldiers would be posthumously honored with military decorations. He explained that the families of these soldiers would be present to receive the awards on behalf of their loved ones, and he wanted to invite Sarah to attend as a special guest. The ceremony would include soldiers from various branches of the military who had displayed extraordinary heroism in combat. Commander Mitchell explained that Sarah's dedication to preserving the memory of fallen heroes made her an appropriate representative of the civilian community's appreciation for military sacrifice. He wanted her to be there as a symbol of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary efforts to honor those who had given their lives in service to their country. Sarah was overwhelmed by the invitation and hardly knew how to respond. The Pentagon ceremony would be attended by high-ranking military officials, government dignitaries, and the families of the honored soldiers. She would be one of only a handful of civilian guests, and her presence would represent recognition of her work at the highest levels of the military establishment. Commander Mitchell also explained that there would be media coverage of the event, including representatives from major news networks and military publications. Sarah's story would likely receive national attention, which could help spread awareness of the importance of remembering fallen soldiers and supporting their families. As the meeting concluded, Commander Mitchell presented Sarah with a special gift, a military challenge coin that had been personally designed by his unit to honor their fallen comrades. The coin featured the same basic design elements as Sarah's tattoo, a helmet, rifle, and boots, along with the motto, "Never Forgotten." He told her that she had earned the right to carry this coin through her dedication to preserving the memory of fallen heroes. The drive home from the naval base was filled with excited conversation as Sarah and her parents discussed the incredible opportunity she had been offered. Her parents were proud, but also concerned about the media attention that might come with attending such a high-profile ceremony. They worried about how their small community might react to Sarah receiving national recognition for something that had initially caused so much controversy. Sarah spent the next few weeks preparing for the Pentagon ceremony, working with Commander Mitchell's staff to coordinate her travel and accommodations. She also continued her research, adding new information to her files about the soldiers who would be honored at the ceremony. She wanted to be fully prepared to represent the civilian community's appreciation for military sacrifice. During this time, word began to spread through Millbrook about Sarah's invitation to the Pentagon ceremony. The local newspaper ran another story about her upcoming trip, and the community's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. People who had initially criticized her tattoo were now expressing pride that someone from their small town was being recognized at such a prestigious military event. Even Mrs. Davidson, who had been so critical of Sarah at the summer festival, stopped by the grocery store to congratulate her and to apologize once again for her earlier comments. She told Sarah that she had learned something important about not judging others too quickly and that she was proud to have someone like Sarah representing their community. As the date of the Pentagon ceremony approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She knew that this event would mark the culmination of everything she had worked toward since beginning her research on fallen soldiers 4 years earlier. It would also serve as ultimate validation that her tattoo and her dedication to honoring military sacrifice were not only appropriate, but were recognized and appreciated at the highest levels of the military. However, Sarah had no idea that the Pentagon ceremony would include a moment of recognition so powerful and unexpected that it would leave everyone in attendance stunned and would forever change how people viewed her tribute to fallen heroes. The ceremony would include not just formal presentations and speeches, but a spontaneous gesture of respect that would prove beyond any doubt that Sarah's mission to honor fallen soldiers was both meaningful and deeply appreciated by those who understood military sacrifice best. The stage was set for Sarah's most important moment, one that would validate everything she had worked for and silence any remaining critics of her unconventional but heartfelt tribute to America's fallen heroes. What happened next would exceed even Sarah's highest expectations and would prove that sometimes the most meaningful recognition comes from the most unexpected sources. The morning of the Pentagon ceremony arrived with unseasonably warm weather for late November, and Sarah woke up in her hotel room near Washington, D.C., feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that had kept her awake for most of the night. She had arrived in the nation's capital the previous afternoon, accompanied by her parents who had insisted on making the trip to support their daughter during this momentous occasion. Sarah spent extra time getting ready that morning, knowing that this day would likely be photographed and remembered for years to come. She had chosen a simple but elegant black dress that would show her tattoo clearly while still being appropriate for such a formal military ceremony. As she looked at herself in the hotel room mirror, Sarah thought about how much her life had changed since that day 4 years ago when she had first started researching fallen soldiers for a high school project. The drive to the Pentagon was surreal for Sarah and her parents. None of them had ever been to Washington, D.C. before, and the sight of the massive military headquarters was both impressive and intimidating. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and Sarah couldn't help but think about all the important decisions that had been made within those walls and all the military operations that had been planned there. Security at the Pentagon was even more stringent than at the naval base where Sarah had met Commander Mitchell. She and her parents went through multiple checkpoints, each one staffed by serious-looking security personnel who carefully examined their identification and the special passes that had been provided by Commander Mitchell's office. The process took nearly an hour, but Sarah found the thoroughness reassuring rather than inconvenient. Once inside the Pentagon, Sarah was struck by the building's combination of grandeur and functionality. The corridors were wide and well-lit, lined with portraits of distinguished military leaders and displays honoring various units and operations. Everywhere she looked, Sarah saw people in military uniforms moving with purpose and efficiency, and she felt honored to be allowed into this inner sanctum of American military power. Commander Mitchell met Sarah and her parents in the lobby and personally escorted them to the ceremony venue, a large auditorium that had been specially prepared for the day's events. The room was filled with military personnel from all branches of service, government officials, and the families of the soldiers who would be honored that day. Sarah noticed that many of the family members were wearing formal attire, but some also displayed their loved ones' military medals and decorations as a way of honoring their memory. As Commander Mitchell introduced Sarah to various attendees, she was amazed by how many people had heard about her story and her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. Several high-ranking officers took time to speak with her personally, thanking her for her commitment and telling her that her work represented the best of civilian support for the military. One general told her that her research and her tattoo demonstrated a level of respect for military sacrifice that many people never achieved, even after years of involvement with military organizations. Sarah was particularly moved when she met the families of the soldiers who would be honored during the ceremony. These Gold Star families welcomed her warmly, treating her like one of their own despite the fact that she had never lost a family member in military service. They understood that Sarah's commitment to honoring fallen soldiers came from the same place as their own dedication to preserving their loved ones' memories. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors and the national anthem, performed by a military choir whose voices filled the auditorium with stirring harmonies. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she listened to the familiar words, thinking about all the soldiers whose names were tattooed on her arm and how they had given their lives to protect the freedoms that anthem represented. The first part of the ceremony consisted of formal presentations of posthumous military decorations to several fallen soldiers. Sarah listened intently as military officials read the citations describing each soldier's heroic actions, and she watched with deep emotion as family members accepted medals and certificates on behalf of their loved ones. The stories of courage and sacrifice were similar to those Sarah had researched about the soldiers from her home county, but hearing them read in this formal military setting gave them even greater impact. During the presentations, Sarah noticed that many of the military personnel in the audience were paying particular attention to her, and she realized that word of her story had spread throughout the military community. Several officers and enlisted personnel nodded respectfully in her direction, and she could see appreciation in their eyes for what she had done to honor fallen soldiers. About halfway through the ceremony, something unexpected happened that would forever change Sarah's life and provide the ultimate validation of her tribute to fallen soldiers. The commanding general of the ceremony, a decorated 3-star general with decades of military service, stepped up to the podium and announced that there would be a special recognition that had not been included in the printed program. General Patricia Williams explained that the military community had recently become aware of a young civilian who had made an extraordinary commitment to honoring fallen soldiers. She described Sarah's research, her tattoo, and her work with military families, telling the audience that such dedication from someone with no personal military connection was both rare and deeply appreciated. As General Williams spoke, Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She had been told that she would be attending the ceremony as an observer, not as someone who would be recognized or honored. The general's words were making it clear that Sarah was about to be acknowledged in front of this distinguished military audience, and she wasn't sure how to react. General Williams then asked Sarah to stand and come to the front of the auditorium. With trembling legs and a pounding heart, Sarah made her way through the rows of seated military personnel and family members, conscious that hundreds of people were watching her every move. When she reached the front of the room, General Williams asked her to face the audience so that everyone could see the tattoo that had generated so much attention and controversy. What happened next left everyone in the auditorium speechless and would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Without any prompting or instruction, Commander Mitchell stood up from his seat in the front row and snapped to attention. A moment later, every military person in the auditorium followed suit, rising to their feet in perfect unison and rendering crisp, formal salutes to Sarah and the fallen soldiers whose names she carried on her arm. The sight was overwhelming and breathtaking. Hundreds of military personnel from all branches of service, including some of the most senior officers in the American military, were saluting a young civilian woman with a tattoo. But they weren't saluting Sarah herself. They were saluting the memory of the fallen heroes she had chosen to honor in such a permanent and meaningful way. The salute lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. During that time, Sarah felt a profound sense of validation and recognition that exceeded anything she had ever imagined. These were people who understood military sacrifice better than anyone else in the world, and they were showing their respect for her dedication to preserving the memory of fallen soldiers. When the military personnel finally lowered their salutes and returned to their seats, there was complete silence in the auditorium. Sarah stood at the front of the room with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the honor that had just been bestowed upon her. General Williams stepped up to the microphone and explained that the spontaneous salute represented the military community's recognition of Sarah's extraordinary commitment to honoring fallen heroes. The general then presented Sarah with a special certificate of appreciation signed by senior officers from all branches of the military, recognizing her dedication to preserving the memory of fallen soldiers. She also received a flag that had been flown over the Pentagon in honor of all fallen military personnel, along with a written statement describing her as an exemplary civilian who has demonstrated the highest level of respect for military sacrifice. As Sarah returned to her seat, she was greeted with sustained applause from the entire audience. Military personnel who had never met her before nodded respectfully in her direction, and several Gold Star family members reached out to shake her hand or give her hugs. The recognition she had received from the military community was complete and unqualified. There could be no doubt that her tattoo and her commitment to honoring fallen soldiers were not only appropriate, but were deeply appreciated by those who mattered most. The remainder of the ceremony passed in a blur for Sarah. She tried to focus on the continued presentations and speeches, but she kept thinking about the moment when hundreds of military personnel had stood and saluted her tribute to fallen soldiers. It was validation beyond anything she could have hoped for when she first decided to get the tattoo that had caused so much controversy in her hometown. After the ceremony concluded, Sarah was surrounded by military personnel and family members who wanted to thank her personally for her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. Several officers told her that her story had already inspired other civilians to take a more active interest in supporting military families and preserving the memory of fallen heroes. Commander Mitchell, who had initiated Sarah's invitation to the Pentagon ceremony, told her that the spontaneous salute from the entire military audience was unprecedented in his experience. He explained that such a gesture was normally reserved for the highest-ranking military officials or for extraordinary acts of heroism. The fact that it had been given to a civilian in recognition of her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers spoke volumes about how much the military community valued her work. As Sarah and her parents prepared to leave the Pentagon that afternoon, they were stopped by members of the media who had covered the ceremony. The spontaneous military salute had been captured by photographers and videographers, and Sarah's story was already being prepared for broadcast on national news programs and for publication in newspapers across the country. The drive back to their hotel was filled with excited conversation about the day's events. Sarah's parents were incredibly proud of their daughter and amazed by the level of recognition she had received from the military community. They knew that their return to Millbrook would be very different from Sarah's previous experiences in their hometown, now that she had been honored at the Pentagon by some of the most senior military officials in the country. That evening, Sarah sat in her hotel room and carefully examined the certificate of appreciation and the flag she had received during the ceremony. She thought about the long journey that had brought her to this point, from a high school research project to national recognition for her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. The criticism and controversy that had surrounded her tattoo now seemed like distant memories, overshadowed by the ultimate validation she had received from the military community. As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she looked at her tattoo in the bathroom mirror and silently spoke the name of each fallen soldier whose memory she carried. Tomorrow she would return to her small Texas town as a nationally recognized advocate for honoring military sacrifice. But tonight she was simply a young woman who had found a way to make a difference in preserving the memory of heroes who might otherwise have been forgotten. The news of Sarah's recognition at the Pentagon ceremony spread across the country even before she and her parents arrived back in Millbrook. The image of hundreds of military personnel saluting a young civilian woman with a memorial tattoo had captured the attention of news outlets nationwide, and Sarah's story was being broadcast on television networks and shared across social media platforms throughout the day. By the time Sarah's plane landed at the regional airport 2 hours from Millbrook, her phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, interview requests from television programs, and messages from people across the country who had been moved by her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. The small-town girl who had been criticized and ridiculed just months earlier was now being hailed as a national symbol of civilian appreciation for military sacrifice. The drive home through familiar countryside gave Sarah time to process everything that had happened and to prepare for what she knew would be a very different reception in her hometown. The Pentagon ceremony had transformed her from a controversial local figure into someone who had received the highest levels of military recognition, and she wondered how her community would react to this dramatic change in her status. As their car approached the Millbrook city limits, Sarah and her parents were amazed to see a large banner strung across Main Street that read, "Welcome home, Sarah, our hometown hero." The banner had been organized by the local veterans organizations, working in cooperation with the mayor's office and several community groups that had previously been silent about Sarah's tribute to fallen soldiers. The first stop was Sarah's home, where she found her front yard filled with flowers, American flags, and handwritten notes from neighbors and community members. Many of the messages were from people who apologized for their earlier criticism of her tattoo and expressed pride in what she had accomplished. Mrs. Davidson, the woman who had confronted Sarah so harshly at the summer festival, had left a particularly touching note along with a beautiful arrangement of red, white, and blue flowers. That evening, the local VFW hall hosted a welcome home reception for Sarah that was attended by nearly half the town. The event had been organized in just 2 days, but The turnout was impressive, and the atmosphere was celebratory. Veterans from multiple conflicts were present, along with active-duty military personnel who were home on leave, Gold Star families, and community members who wanted to show their support for Sarah's work. Mayor Robert Jenkins officially proclaimed the day as Sarah Martinez Day in Millbrook, presenting her with a key to the city and a resolution recognizing her dedication to honoring fallen soldiers. The mayor acknowledged that the community had not always understood or appreciated Sarah's mission, but he emphasized that her national recognition had made everyone proud to call her a neighbor and friend. The highlight of the reception came when Janet Morrison, the Gold Star family's coordinator who had first welcomed Sarah into their organization, announced the establishment of the Sarah Martinez Memorial Scholarship Fund. The scholarship would provide financial assistance to local students who demonstrated a commitment to preserving military history or supporting veterans organizations. The fund had been started with donations from military families and veterans groups, but Janet announced that contributions were already coming in from across the country from people who had heard Sarah's story. During her remarks at the reception, Sarah spoke about how grateful she was for the community's support and how honored she felt to represent Millbrook on the national stage. She emphasized that her recognition at the Pentagon was not really about her personally, but was about the importance of remembering and honoring all fallen soldiers. She reminded the audience that the 23 names tattooed on her arm represented real people with families and dreams, and that their sacrifice should never be forgotten. The reception also featured remarks from several veterans who spoke about the impact Sarah's work had made on their lives and on the broader military community. Master Sergeant William Rodriguez, whose brother Michael was one of the soldiers whose name Sarah carried on her arm, thanked her for keeping his brother's memory alive and for helping ensure that future generations would know about his sacrifice. In the days following the reception, Sarah's life continued to change in ways she had never expected. She received dozens of interview requests from national media outlets, and her story was featured in major newspapers and magazines across the country. A television documentary crew asked permission to follow her for several weeks to create a program about civilian efforts to honor military sacrifice. Most significantly, Sarah began receiving invitations to speak at military events and veterans gatherings across the country. Military organizations wanted her to share her story as an example of how ordinary civilians could make extraordinary contributions to honoring fallen soldiers. She was invited to speak at the annual Marine Corps Birthday Ball, the Army's annual memorial service, and several veterans conventions. One of the most meaningful invitations came from the family of Corpsman Michael Chun, whose parents asked Sarah to speak at a memorial service marking the 5th anniversary of their son's death. The service was held in California, and Sarah was amazed by the number of Marines who attended to honor their fallen comrade. During her remarks, she shared what she had learned about Michael's life and service, and she watched as hardened warriors were moved to tears by her words. Sarah's recognition also opened doors for her education and career plans. Several universities offered her full scholarships, recognizing her research skills and her commitment to military history. She ultimately chose to attend a school in Virginia that had a strong military history program and was located near several important military installations where she could continue her research and advocacy work. The scholarship offers were not the only educational opportunities that came Sarah's way. The Smithsonian Institution invited her to participate in a special project documenting civilian efforts to honor military sacrifice, and the National Archives offered her an internship position that would allow her to work with military records and help other researchers access information about fallen soldiers. As Sarah prepared to leave for college in the fall, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that day 4 years earlier when she had first decided to research fallen soldiers for a high school project. What had started as a simple assignment had evolved into a personal mission that had brought her national recognition and had opened doors she never could have imagined. The controversy that had initially surrounded her tattoo now seemed like a distant memory. The same community members who had once criticized her decision were now proudly claiming her as their hometown hero. The tattoo that had once been a source of ridicule was now recognized as a meaningful tribute that had earned the respect of the highest levels of the military establishment. On her last night in Millbrook before leaving for college, Sarah visited the county cemetery where many of the soldiers whose names she carried were buried. She walked through the rows of headstones, stopping at each grave to leave a small American flag and to say a silent prayer of thanks. These young men had given their lives in service to their country, and Sarah had found a way to ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. As she stood among the graves in the gathering twilight, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. She had faced criticism and ridicule for her decision to honor fallen soldiers with her tattoo, but she had persevered because she knew her mission was important. The recognition she had received from the military community had validated her choice, but, even more importantly, it had shown that ordinary people could make extraordinary contributions to preserving the memory of those who had served. Sarah's story had inspired others across the country to take a more active interest in honoring military sacrifice. She regularly received emails from people who had been moved by her dedication and who wanted to start their own projects to support veterans or preserve military history. Teachers were using her story in their classrooms to teach students about the importance of remembering fallen soldiers, and several other young people had gotten their own memorial tattoos inspired by Sarah's example. As she prepared to begin the next chapter of her life, Sarah knew that her work honoring fallen soldiers was far from over. She planned to use her college years to expand her research and to develop new ways of preserving military history. She wanted to create a comprehensive database of fallen soldiers from her state, complete with photos, service records, and family stories that would ensure their sacrifices were never forgotten. The tattoo that had once been a source of controversy had become Sarah's life's work and her calling. Every day, she carried with her the names and memories of 23 heroes who had given their lives in service to others. Their stories had changed her life, and through her dedication to preserving their memory, Sarah had found a way to honor their sacrifice and to inspire others to never forget the price of freedom. The young woman who had once been ridiculed for her unusual tattoo was now recognized as a national advocate for honoring military sacrifice. She had proven that meaningful tribute could take many forms and that genuine respect for fallen soldiers could earn recognition from the highest levels of the military community. Sarah's journey from small-town controversy to national recognition showed that sometimes the most important work begins with a single person's decision to remember those who might otherwise be forgotten. As she looked one last time at the graves of the fallen soldiers whose names she carried, Sarah made a silent promise to continue their mission of service in her own way. They had served their country in uniform, and she would serve by ensuring that their stories lived on for future generations. The tattoo on her arm was more than just ink and skin. It was a permanent commitment to honor the memory of America's fallen heroes, and Sarah was determined to spend her life living up to that commitment.